Okay, so I'm going to talk for about maybe 35 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions, answers, observations, shared learnings. But ideally, this session will equip you with some essential sort of peer influencing skills by exploring influence dynamics, understanding the significance of peer dynamics. We're going to try collectively to identify some key fears and acknowledge challenges to influencing. And then we're going to apply a few learning strategies, which I hope you will all gain some opportunity to get some high takeaway value from that. And then a piece on developing resilience and handling rejection with confidence. I'm going to maybe split this into sort of three sections. The first section will be around peer influence. The second one will be around handling rejection. And the third one will be around resilience. I think we'll probably, Ella, if it's okay with you, stop after the peer influence section to give people an opportunity to maybe ask some questions along the way.
Perfect.
So I guess by way of context, a little bit of background on Filshill and myself, just to give those of you who are not aware of our business a little bit of context. So Filshill is a family business. We're celebrating a 150-year anniversary this year. A lot of people would describe our business as a family business, but we internally, like to describe ourselves as a business for families. Family business, I guess, articulates ownership in my view, but business for families really articulates our culture and our values. I've been involved in wholesale for 27 years, and the past 14 years as CEO, I took over at the age of 33 from my dad, who retired rather quickly due to ill health. I thought I knew about the business. I'd spent a lot of time in every single department, understanding the people, the processes, but nobody had ever told me how to run a business. I'd never had any training. And in true family business style, it was just sort of landed on my desk at short notice. I thought the right thing for me to do would be to help everybody get involved in every decision making process, because that's the way the new CEO should behave. And I couldn't have got it more wrong. By doing that, created a culture of upward delegation, which ultimately led me to getting 300-400 emails a day, no decisions being made in the business, and the business becoming really sluggish. So after 6 months, I knew I needed to change. I built an incredible team around me, and many of you will know some of my colleagues. At that point, we decided that we wanted to create some real structure around the business. We built a 10-year target, a 3-year picture, and a 1-year plan. The 1-year plan was broken into 4 90-day bursts. One of the most important things that we did was built an accountability chart where every bit of process was mapped out across the business and attributed to an individual or a department. The leads in these departments or the individuals are completely empowered to make decisions based around their accountability. We have weekly meetings with a dozen managers every Tuesday. These meetings last no more than 45 minutes. First thing we do is a mental health check-in, one word to describe how you're feeling at home and one word to describe how you're feeling at work. Then each manager is given 3 minutes uninterrupted to update on the past 7 days. They have to update on issues that they faced that they were able to overcome, opportunities that they've identified, and how they have used AI in the past 7 days. That process has led to real momentum within the business, and I guess aligned to my leadership style around being empathetic. Vulnerable, I think, is really important from my perspective. Of course, empowering our people, being strategic, being very proud of what we have here, and being fiercely ambitious. The business typically applies a co-prosperity model where the only way that our business is going to succeed is if our suppliers win, if our customers win, if our colleagues win, and our communities win. And it's that co-prosperity mindset, as a family business, allows us to play the long game. And I guess that's been endorsed by the Advantage Group Mirror Report, where Filshill has been ranked #1 in delivered wholesale in the UK 14 years in a row. So we believe that this model works for us. I spend a fair bit of time, which I thoroughly enjoy, doing some coaching, training, mentoring. I'm the chairman of an entrepreneurial competition in Scotland, similar to Dragon's Den, where we support startup businesses and early stage growth businesses with loans and grant funding up to £3 million twice a year. I do some coaching with industry CEOs, some suppliers, some other wholesalers, and I also coach a female golf professional, not in how to play golf, but actually to try and apply a business approach to professional sport. We believe that she's the first female professional golfer in the UK to have a business-led approach to her skill set and her business of being a professional. And I've also recently learned how and trained in becoming an AI trainer. Went out to Dubai to learn how to go from being AI curious to AI serious. And now I'm a formal trainer and I'm doing some training for some of our suppliers. We've currently got 70 colleagues across the business going through that process. So that is a little bit about me and Filshill. The power of peer influence is very clear. It's very easy just to apply this to our business environment or our careers, but peer influence can be used in all areas of our lives, whether that's in our relationships, whether that's in our social lives, but it does increase opportunities. Being able to influence does open doors. It certainly builds stronger relationships through better results and teamwork. And it builds confidence. Successful influence will build self-confidence and self-assurance. And of course, with success through that process can create career growth. So I'd like maybe if you would all go into the text box, I'd like to do a little bit of an icebreaker around fears around peer influence. So if you wouldn't mind just jumping into the text box and just type in a few words on any fears that you think exist in influencing peers.
Can I just check that people are able to write their comments? Fantastic. Thank you, Izzy. So I'll just read them out, Simon. So we've got saying the wrong thing in front of groups of people, imposter syndrome, not being taken seriously, societal issues, imposter syndrome again, putting forward silly ideas, not getting support, lack of support, being judged, imposter syndrome again, conflicts, imposter syndrome, conflicts again, how you're seen outwardly, how you look, imposter syndrome again, ideas not being good enough. The list goes on.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
This is great. Okay, so the next question I'd like you to answer is, what challenges specifically exist for women influencing peers? So I guess there'll be some that will have been repeated from the first question, but is there anything specific that you think exists for women in particular?
Not being taken seriously, too emotional, not being listened to, being not taken seriously again, emotional. So lots of patterns here. Coming across too aggressive and bossy.
Stereotypes, yep. Okay, these are fantastic. And Ella, if you wouldn't mind just maybe sort of capturing these at some point, because we can build out on some of these within the Q&A. I'd like to get some experiences, shared experiences of these things, and maybe talk about how we might overcome those types of scenarios, maybe later on in the Q&A.
Yeah.
So the fear and challenges, these are, some of these I've highlighted. Many, people experience these common fears like rejection. Appearing pushy was one of the comments. And being heard in meetings, overcoming bias, that fear of rejection, being aggressive or pushy, fear of damaging relationships, fear of failure, I think, are typical traits of nervousness around peer influence. And of course, being heard in meetings, negotiating confidently, overcoming bias, and some of the sort of physical things like, the appearance of blushing or a nervous voice can also sort of, manifest itself, in some instances there. So I guess, we're all very different, and there's no such thing as an average profile. So I just wanted to sort of caveat that a little bit in terms of this slide, and these are sort of generic traits, but maybe things that you may be able to identify with from your own personal experience. And influencing male peers and influencing female peers, can be different mechanisms and different, theories of how best to approach. So in terms of influencing male peers around communication, male peers typically prefer direct, concise messaging, whereas female peers, value context and collaboration and relationship build. If you're going to screenshot any of these slides, this is probably a good one to do, because there's a little bit of content. Apologies for how busy it is, but I think there is some good content in here. In terms of persuasion approach, male peers would respond well to the use of logic and facts and data, whereas female peer influence, using storytelling, emotional intelligence, and live examples in order to persuade the point, is an effective mechanism. In terms of decision making, male peers very task focused and results driven. When influencing a peer, consider the team impact and inclusivity of a wider group. Of course, the framing of ideas. Male peers, like to respond to, efficiency and competition and, hard, cold facts around financial benefits, whereas female peers would typically respond to, the collaboration, the shared success, and long-term value. These are, both the processes of communication, persuasion, decision, framing of ideas. The end output is ultimately the same goal. It's just the process of how do you get to that end goal, quicker. Handling debate and pushback, male peers would be pretty comfortable with direct challenges and debate. Female peers would like to seek agreement and avoid confrontation whilst getting, to the end point. Of course, longer term influence over time, building respect by demonstrating expertise and decisiveness is a response that males would respond to. Females building trust, long-term trust through relationships. Empathy is obviously a key element to that. Negotiation style. Males tend to try and shorten the time scale here. Respond to straightforward win-win negotiations. Female influence would be very much about fairness and group benefit and collaboration. And using phrases like, this will increase revenue by 10%, being assertive in that communication to male peers. Similar communication, this will help our team work better when responding to females. So there's a little bit of a patchwork there. And as I said earlier, there's no such thing as the average profile, but trying to identify the right line of communication, depending on the peers that you're trying to influence, can be incredibly powerful. So some practical tips. Effective influence combines, essentially finding some common ground, projecting confidence, supporting with data, and timing your approach strategically. Reading the room is a really, really important part of peer influence. Learning when to time your influence in that discussion can be highly effective. One of the tips and the things that I've found over the years is trying to understand your peers' learning style. How do they learn? How do they respond? Do they respond through, graphs and charts or pictures or content, or just learning, on the job? If you can understand the learning style of the peer that you're trying to influence, that will help the context of how you're trying to make that influence stick. When talking with Elliot about this presentation, she suggested that trying to drill down a little bit into some techniques that might help in terms of influencing male peers. So I've maybe identified sort of 9 techniques that might be helpful. Being direct is really important with the clear to the point messaging. We should do X because it will achieve Y. That direct communication demonstrates confidence, demonstrates, research, demonstrates passion. And that's a really important part of that influence process. Using logic, so use the stats, use the data. We're all completely focused, obsessed by data now. Much of our decision making is being based on data to narrow, the opportunity for failure. So data is a really impactful and powerful way to use logic when influencing, male peers and male colleagues. Also bring in the element of competition into this. Frame it as a way of staying ahead of the competition, being first to market, creating competitive advantage for your business will be, a good technique to use in terms of that. Project authority, assertiveness always earns respect. This is the best approach because be prepared for debate, and pushback. Debate and pushback are ways in which people learn to gain greater depth of content and information and defend your points logically. Don't, feel if you're being questioned that you should back down. Use the data to really defend your logic, defend your points, and go into that with confidence. Remaining task orientated, this plan drives efficiency. That's the task, that's the goal that we're trying to achieve. Be very clear in that communication style. And I guess the last 3, use clear language. This will work because bring in the risk and reward concept of securing X will deliver Y if we act now. And be independent. Self-sufficiency is highly valued. I've taken ownership of this. I've mapped this out. This is the right thing to do. Showing independence and self-sufficiency, I guess, builds authority in that conversation. So what are the sort of key learnings and key takeaways from this? Be direct and logical. Avoid emotional appeals, be very structured in terms of, the positioning, demonstrate confidence, be prepared for debate. Pushback isn't rejection, it's about depth of clarity, and frame it in terms of results. How do we show value really quickly in that conversation? So I guess just to summarize that section, different influence strategies work better with different audiences. As I said, there's no such thing as an average profile, but use direct fact-based approaches with male peers while building relationships and collaboration with female peers. And if you can get the balance right between the two, and of course you will have to blend these depending on the audience, but that would, I suggest, lead to a more confident approach and more aligned way of trying to build confidence and success in any peer influence situation. So I'm just going to stop and pause there for a moment, and maybe just open up for any questions that anybody has in relation to that, or any observations or any thoughts or shared experiences. Anyone got a question or a comment to make?
Maybe I'll start, Simon.
Okay.
Yeah, so I absolutely love all that advice. It's brilliant. So what happens if you apply it and for one reason or another you don't get buy-in? Maybe it's not another person's priority right now. Maybe it clashes with their plans, but you still really feel like this could be a win for the business. Do you go over their head, or do you just work harder to persuade them, or do you just park it for a bit?
No, I don't think you park it. I think it's about gaining an understanding of what the roadblocks are. Is that a timing thing? Is it a resource thing? Is it a budgetary thing? And I guess it's trying to understand the roadblocks, try and build some quick wins. What are the successes in the build up to this? And then think about the timing of repositioning. But I'm actually going to cover some of this off later on around repositioning the concept after a depth of clarity.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Vicky from Cisco is saying the influencing tactics look like how you'd use insights colors to think about how you communicate with colleagues. Oh yeah, yeah, the red-green relationships thing. Great to put a gender lens on it. Does that sound familiar, Simon?
I'm not overly familiar with the sort of color concept, but the traffic light process. I would always say in any of these scenarios, it's never a no, it's just a not yet. And trying to understand, when the
Mm.
right timing is for that. But yeah, if there is a different dynamic around, the gender lens aligned to that established color scheme that Vicky's talking about, then that's probably quite a useful thing if you know that process to try and think about that through a slightly different lens.
But to summarize, understand the roadblocks, build quick wins, time your repositioning, and a no is not a no. It might just be a not yet. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah. Okay. If there isn't any more questions, then I'll just move on to the next section, which is relatively short. And this is about handling rejection. Um, Nobody likes rejection, whether that's in your personal life or your business life. Um, but rejection is an opportunity for growth. And if you can take a step back from the rejection, view it as constructive feedback, seeking deeper clarity, as we mentioned earlier, ask specifics, ask one more question to build your knowledge of the reasons, the blockages. Try and stay calm. If we are committed to an idea that we know is going to impact the business, but it's rejected, it's very easy to get frustrated by that. But staying professional in the context, I think, is really, really important. And I guess what we just discussed a second ago was, you know, factor in a committed time for follow-up. So say, okay, can I come back to you in a month or 6 weeks' time with a follow-up proposal on this idea if it was a timing challenge, for instance? And don't accept no. It's not forever. Just think about how we may pivot that process of rejection. Use it to try and build some resilience build a bounce back plan. So having some structure to a bounce back plan can be really, really useful in terms of, reframing it by identifying the roadblocks. Are the initial roadblocks the actual roadblocks? So the more questions you can ask to drive depth in that, the greater the understanding. Gather support from others. So you won't be the only person that thinks this is a good idea. Canvass the idea with colleagues. Who are the other influencers? It's not about going over the heads of others, but share ideas, share thoughts. What are those roadblocks? How would others overcome some of those? Having allies, we all have them in our business, we have them in our personal lives. Gather support for your concept, understand through your ally network, are you being, too firm on this point? Where could we pivot this point? What is the ups and downs of a slightly different scenario? And seek to adjust your proposal, having thought about that, having gathered the feedback and gathered support, and then reattempt. But always make sure that you keep your influence alive. If you're going to meet again in 6 weeks' time, those short conversations, around the direction of travel towards the pivot and the adjustment of the proposal can be really, really impactful when you come to delivering that message in the 6 week time, to keep the discussion open. I love this photo of Jess. That clenched fist looking incredibly resilient, and it's just a great, great shot here. And that, ability to bounce back from rejection through mindset shift, support systems, and celebrating progress. When we're building resilience, we have to reframe rejection. We all face it, and we should treat it as learning. Implement, resilience around that growth mindset. Find the allies within the business and take the small wins. Momentum is really, really important. Chip away at the small wins and actually celebrate them. Whether you're patting yourself on the back or sharing those small wins with colleagues can really help build your resilience and strength through this challenging process potentially of rejection in the first phase. Role play is a really good use to help you build your resilience. Practice responding professionally to rejection whilst keeping the conversation, and influence intact. So find a colleague or a family member and listen, it can be quite good fun. It can be quite awkward at times, kicking through role play, but if you can go through that process. So if you have a scenario that your idea has been rejected, your task is to respond professionally, but keep that conversation wide open by seeking further clarity. The objective here is really to keep the influence alive. So, have a go at role playing, with a colleague, a friend, a family member, to really build up that resilience platform and have a go at that not yet scenario. Role play the resilience mechanism, maintaining eye contact is one of the strongest things in terms of communicating resilience physically. Practice maintaining composure. If somebody's dismissed your proposal, stay composed, get the clarity, create additional variables for consideration in that initial positioning. So have a think about what variables you may want to position, and role play is a really cool way to really do that. I always say nowadays that practice makes perfect is no longer good enough. Perfect practice makes perfect. So if you have a scenario where you're positioning some influence, really go through that as though it's a live scenario with a colleague so that you're well prepared ahead of that. Try and identify what potential blockers might come ahead of you. Because if you understand what variables might be there, then you're going to be better prepared to respond to that. So the resilience mindset, face rejection, right? Because everybody gets rejected at some point, whether it's in our work lives or our personal lives. Use that as an opportunity to learn, work out how you trial and adjust, and just refuse to stop. So keep thinking. If you are completely committed to the concept, the idea, the thought, then pivot and keep going until you've run that to ground. The people, the peers, whether it's male or female, will respond well to that continuous approach of trying to work out a way to, and that is very, very important. So what are the key takeaways around resilience? Rejection is part of the process. Use your influence strategically, whether that's with the peer that you're trying to influence or building support from allies and colleagues. Stay confident. If your idea, your thought makes a lot of sense to you, be confident in pursuing that with the language and communication styles that you know. And influence grows. So keep going. If the ideas eventually run to ground, we're all entrepreneurial. The next idea will come along pretty quickly. So I guess what's next from the learning that we've maybe picked a few points up? Think about who is it that you want to influence. Identify a person that you want to influence in the next day or two or week or the next month. Think about the process. Think about the communication style and the language attributed to the situation, the individual. Of course, try and understand their learning techniques, because that will help influence how you position the concept. So apply some of those strategies. Try and track your results. So, measure how the first, interaction went. What were the pivots? What were the changes? What does the success chain look like post that? And of course, practice makes perfect is no longer good enough. Perfect practice makes perfect. So I said at the beginning of this that I was going to share an image of two incredible peer influencers. The first was Elliot, and the second one is Amanda Casey. So some of you may know Amanda. She's pretty active in the Women in Wholesale network, but she is somebody that has created a phenomenal safety and well-being culture, placed mental health and well-being at the very heart of the Filshill business strategy by influencing her peers. And it's not just about influencing on decision making, it's about influencing on a movement of getting everybody engaged in a process. And I'm really, really proud of Amanda for what she's done, not only in our business, but for the wider wholesale industry. And this is a picture we took at the parliamentary reception a few weeks ago. She is an absolute peer superstar, along with Elliot and many others. So Elliot's definitely going to share these slides with everybody. But listen, love to get into some Q&A and some shared experiences here. So I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay, does anyone have a question or an observation or a shared experience of something maybe that they've struggled with, in terms of peer influence, but now maybe has an idea or thought about how they can maybe take it forward from the learnings from this morning?
Hi, Simon. It's Claire from Muller Milk and Ingredients here.
Hi, Claire.
I just want to say that's really great. We have a Women in Muller network that we have been working on for about a year and a half now, and this really fits in. But you've gone a bit deeper in your thought process. It's all about communication, isn't it? One way or the other. And thank you for all the ideas that you've generated here. I just want to say that I think that women's brains definitely are very different to men's. And I think we're all learning that, because 15 years ago, I would have just had to adapt my behavior And now it feels like everybody's understanding that they need to adapt their own.
Thank you, Claire. And listen, it's definitely just about knowing your audience. I think we've heard that 1,000 times over our careers, but really in this scenario is really understanding the individual as well as the audience, and where does the balance of decision making come? The ability to bring allies to the table who support, to support your concept, is a sort of, different matrix in terms of the influence, because you're influencing support as well as influencing decisions. And, if you can work out who the audience is, it makes it, a lot easier.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Claire.
Hi, Simon. Sorry, it's Laura
Hi.
Jarman here from Best Way. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks.
Oh, good. Thank you for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful. I've made loads of notes. I've been tapping away. I've got a few IT issues this morning, so I'm having to view you on my phone. Unfortunately, my Wi-Fi's gone down, so apologies for not having the camera on. But
Oh, that's okay.
It's been absolutely wonderful. I'm really early in my sort of personal development stage, and I just made a note in the comments, and Elliot just asked if I wanted to jump on and to sort of explain it. But a colleague is also very early into their personal development as well, and we've sort of been helping each other out by doing a bit of role play. Although it feels quite strange and a bit awkward at times, it really has helped us sort of frame conversations and sort of gain a little bit more confidence, sort of discussing points between one another before we sort of go and take it to the wider business. And it sort of helped us sort of gain that confidence. And yeah, I'd urge people to give it a go, even though it does feel a bit strange.
Yeah, and listen, there's always a sort of nervous laughter when you role play. It's a great way of sort of removing a little bit of the tension. So listen, if you have a colleague that has, similar challenges, similar experiences, it's a great way of actually trying to remove the fear of, speaking up and getting a point across. And yeah, the more we do this, the more we train ourselves to become comfortable with the idea. So yeah, no, that's great, and I'm pleased to hear that.
Hey, Nicole, would you like to go next?
Hi, Simon.
Hi,
Thanks so much
Nicole,
for
how
your
are you?
time today. I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, great.
Good. That was great. I really appreciated all of the content. Definitely insightful, and it's, I think, good to just feel validated at times. My one's not something that I'm personally struggling with a lot at the minute, but I think it will cover a lot of struggles of people potentially on the call. So I joined a company which is a huge company, a fantastic company. I really, really love working there. But what I've found is they retain their staff very well. And I think that goes within the wholesale channel as well. There's a lot of people that have been in the industry for 20, 30 years. And one thing that I have faced and still face to this day is going up against people who have been in the industry, veterans of the industry, looking at me as somebody that's young, that's potentially female. It's not gender specific, it's everybody that deals with this. But learning whether to try and move the dial of their habitual ways of working, or just to let them be who they are and potentially either overrule you or dismiss you or kind of look at you like, what do you know? It's a battle that I face with my buyers, it's a battle I face with internal peers, external, and I imagine quite a lot of people on this call also do. So I guess I'm just asking, what would be your advice? Do you think in those situations of people that have been doing what they've been doing for 20 plus years, do you try and move the dial, or do you just keep your head down and appreciate that people have different ways of working?
Listen, that's a great point, and it's actually something that I recognize inside our business. So nobody ever leaves our business. Now, the problem with that is that all of the ideas and the entrepreneurial thinking happens within the four walls of this. So the entrepreneurial thinking thinks about, how do we fix the stuff that we know? Now, any business that isn't thinking about the future will be disrupted. So I mentioned AI earlier. You know, amount of people that I speak to that haven't even started the AI journey within their businesses is utterly terrifying, and it's going to disrupt our entire industry. Now, without having individuals that can bring a different perspective to this, the industry, the economy is going to be facing some pretty tough challenges here. And if we think that just by removing a few costs and doing the same thing is going to improve, one thing's for sure is that your competitors, our competitors, will be thinking about the next thing. So that concept of encouraging reverse mentoring, and I'm a big fan of this. So, why should I, with 27 years experience, have a one-way mentoring experience with somebody that's starting up in the industry? I actually want that individual to mentor me in the way that our future consumers are thinking, behaving, how they're using technology, how they're being influenced, how they make their decisions around products on sustainability and these types of things. So it would be remiss of any business leader to ignore innovative thinking, particularly as the industry that we are in and the economy is going to be under significant pressure. So if you think about how you might frame that, industry veterans only know how to do things the way that they've done them for a very long time. And if you can create what I refer to as positive disruption, so not negative disruption where you're trying to create friction, if you can create positive disruption around how to think about or position a concept in a slightly different way, then that would be a really interesting thing to try and investigate. Gaining support from others within your cohort, sitting down with these industry veterans and saying, hey, listen, we're coming into a bit of a challenge here. What is your thoughts about this? Here are my thoughts about it. It doesn't have to be about positioning a concept or an idea. It can be about positioning your own personal thoughts in an informal conversation over a coffee, over some lunch, just sharing the ideas. And I can guarantee you that any progressive business that isn't encouraging alternative thinking and positive disruption is going to get left behind. As simple as that.
Thanks. Well, what I take from that is just to trust your position at the table and just think collaboratively. And if there are people at that table that don't think collaboratively and aren't thinking forward, then they'll likely get left behind. That's what I took from that.
Yep, I think that's right. That's my opinion anyway.
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate that.
Pleasure.
Hi, Simon. I'm Olivia and I work for DCS. I'm one of the commercial managers.
Hi, Olivia.
This is like my first involvement with women in wholesale. So Zara forwarded the invite on to me, and I just want to say it was absolutely fabulous. I thought it was excellent, the content you shared. Really, really helpful. My sort of biggest takeaway from it is just feeling reassured by everybody else in a similar position, particularly when we were popping our answers into the chat box. I kept going to put in something and then could see that somebody else had already written it. So I think I just feel more confident already knowing that I'm not alone in how I'm feeling, particularly in quite a male-dominated industry, really. It was great. Yeah, so just thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia. Can I just circle back to imposter syndrome? So that came up in the chat quite a lot. Would somebody like to just give me a little bit of context around that, just so we can maybe just open up a little bit of a discussion and get some views from others?
Sorry, it's me again. My imposter syndrome sort of comes from myself, really. So last week we had our quarterly sales conference and I was asked to present by our head of commercial, and straight away wanted the ground to swallow me up. I thought, no way can I do that. It's normally, the directors of the company that take those positions in presenting, and I really put myself down about it. But actually, and taken away from what you've said today, Simon, is I knew what I was presenting on, and I probably knew better than anybody else in the room what I was presenting on, and that's why I was asked to do it. And just having the confidence in myself in knowing what I'm saying, the numbers I'm sharing. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a personal journey to work on.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have been asked to do that if people didn't believe that one, everyone didn't want to hear what you were going to say, and two, actually that point you made about no one else knows what I'm going to say, so it doesn't really matter if I miss a couple of lines or a couple of points. And Olivia, I've known you for about 3 minutes, but I strongly suspect that perfect practice makes perfect, got you into a position where you're able to deliver that with confidence.
Yeah, I think I noticed on one of your slides, one of the bits for women was like a nervous, shaky voice, and that is definitely something that happens to me. And I just, like, talking to you now, I'm fine, but put me in front of a room of lots of people, I just can't get control of it, and that's the thing that like panics me the most, I think, about it.
Yeah, and listen, there's some great techniques to be able to do that. Drinking water room temperature as opposed to ice cold water when you're speaking. Ice cold water compresses your vocal cords. So, something really simple like that. Breathing exercises, just really staying calm. I always approach these things that nobody watching this presentation would rather be standing doing it themselves. So actually everyone's willing you to succeed. Nobody's sitting there hoping that you make a mess of it. And often people get nervous and flushed because all of a sudden it becomes quite overwhelming in terms of the people, and what happens if I make a mess of this and the messaging is incorrect, or my boss doesn't like the content. But actually, if you understand the message that you want to deliver, and use breathing exercises and make sure you're hydrated and all those sort of basic things, hopefully that can be overcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
We have time for another question if anyone else has anything else they'd like to share.
Okay, it looks as though maybe the questions are sort of closing up a little. So, listen, Ella's going to share this. Please do connect me on LinkedIn. I'd love to get your feedback if there's any questions you've got. If you wanted to jump on a call just to dig into some components of this as your peer influence skills develop, then I'm more than happy to do that. And of course, when our song hits the UK charts, if you can all download it, because it'd be great to get it to #1.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. This has been an absolutely brilliant session. Lots of really valuable content and takeaways. So we're going to share the slides afterwards, and we'll also upload the video onto our YouTube channel. So thank you again, Simon. You've been absolutely brilliant. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of the day. And I did pop a link in the chat if you want to stay up to date with future events.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
Thanks a lot.
See ya.